My name is Jack McLean. I'm your host, and tonight my guest is Daniel Cherny. He is the current sports journalist at Code. Previously has worked as a sports writer for The Age and a freelancer for various digital media companies. For those new to the podcast, our mission here at Prepare Like a Pro is to empower aspiring athletes and staff with practical knowledge from some of the industry's most inspiring individuals and to strengthen the AFL community. If you like the show, please show support by following us on Instagram and subscribing to the podcast. We're on iTunes, Spotify, and YouTube. Welcome, Daniel. Thanks for jumping on, mate.
Pleasure to be here. Thanks, Jack.
Let's dive in the very beginning of your career. At what age did you discover that you had a passion for sports journalism?
When I think back, it was probably there even from as a very young kid when I really stepped back now. Probably from the age of as early as I can remember, which is about the age of 5 or 6, I would devour, even as soon as I could read, I suppose, or even probably before I could, devour the sports pages. We used to get the Age delivered at home, and I would, probably at the very early days, it was looking through who everyone tipped, and maybe looking through the teams, and maybe as my grasp of the English language got better, I probably read more of the actual stories themselves and look at the pictures. And I remember going to games as a kid, and would love to get the footy record and read through that stuff. And I'd have my dad would record games, and then I would the night games, and back in the VHS days, probably dates me a bit, but which and watch them the following morning. So certainly immersed myself in listened to the games on the radio from a very young age, and commentate games in the corridor or in the backyard. So probably always had that sort of interest in sport, and particularly footy, but other sports as well. I played a little bit of junior sport as a kid. Was never particularly good. Generally enjoyed it, but it was very clear from a very early age that it was never going to be anything. Was never going to go into any great heights there. So I suppose probably from a young age there was an interest that that looked like the next best thing, or the cool thing to be a sports commentator or sports journalist or writer or reporter. And there's probably always a little bit of interest there. Even I edited my school newspaper when I was in year 12. Always had a bit of a passion for that. I finished school in 2008, and I didn't initially go into sports journalism. I actually started a commerce law degree at Monash. Sorry, we just dropped there for a sec. A commerce law degree at Monash, which I'll cut to the chase. I did finish it eventually, but I struggled my way through it. My part was probably never really in it. I probably always had the passion for sport and media, but didn't necessarily think it was a realistic goal to start with. Maybe thought, if I got the marks, I would go down the conventional path, sort of the more conventional path, with other people, others in my family had done, or some of my friends were doing. But probably after a couple of years, I thought, no, I'm not really enjoying this. I want to at least dabble a bit in the side in sports media. And I started up a website with a bunch of mates. I got the idea from a website in the UK called Test Match Sofa, who were doing a sort of a lighthearted cricket commentary off the couch in England. And we started doing something called Footy Couch, which was streaming an AFL commentary thing for a couple of years, and we actually did some shows at the Comedy Festival as well. But anyway, one thing led to another. I started doing a bit of writing for a website called Backpage Lead, and then and did some local footy commentary. But I got a big break in, and increasingly was sort of putting my feelers out for jobs, and got a big break in sort of late 2013, early 2014, when I was recommended for had my name put forward for a contract at The Age, and was very lucky to get that, and was there sort of for the almost 8 years after that, and just recently moved to Code Sports, so this new startup. So was very lucky in that respect. But yeah, I suppose to answer the initial question in a long-winded way, it was probably from a pretty young age that there was certainly elements of passion there, and it probably just had to evolve, I suppose, over a period of time to get to 2013, 14, and then today.
Yeah, no, thanks for sharing, mate, and the open and honesty. I think that would resonate with a few people in that you're passionate about it from a very young age. That's not that common, but following the feeling of following the conventional path certainly is, from peers and family and friends and what everyone else is doing. And you mentioned, for a 3 to 5 year patch there, you were sort of exploring different avenues and trying some things out. How important, looking back now, do you think that was, like, starting up a website with your mates and doing the footy couch and playing around with things at the laboratory phase, let's call it? When you look back now, do you think that's quite important for those listening that might want to be a sports journalist or sports commentator, like you said?
Yeah, I think overall, yeah, it was, and you probably don't necessarily realize it at the time, but I think one thing that I always try to impress, and like I don't, I'm still myself, I'm reasonably experienced, but I'm still, I wouldn't say I'm a veteran by any stretch, but I try to impress to when you talk to younger people or even older people who are trying to make inroads into the field, and it can be difficult, is that I think more than anything, you need initiative. It's just not going to just happen. It doesn't just happen. I mean, you can get luck along the way, and you can have. But I do believe that you do make your own luck. And for instance, my big break was definitely getting the job at the Age, but that came about after, and it wasn't. I was lucky in the sense that it probably didn't take me. Some people might take 10 years. I was lucky it probably took 2 or 3 of sort of reasonable, I suppose, unpaid grift, so to speak. But yeah, I think it was good. I think you show to prospective employers that you have, that you're keen, that you have initiative, that you have ideas, that you have creativity, and you also probably hone some of the skills at that point as well. And it's interesting. I probably at that stage in 2010, 11, 12, even I probably was more, even 13. I was probably more thinking along the lines of if it was into sports broadcasting or commentary, but I was also doing a bit of writing on the side, and the writing, which sort of probably came about as a result of some of the commentary, at least through Footy Couch. So it was a good example of how sometimes your skills, if you go down a certain path, that can then open doors to other skill sets. And in that early, you said laboratory phase, you end up trying a lot of different things. And initially, some of the writing I was doing was sort of quite light-hearted, and sort of almost sort of comedic sort of writing. And I've probably taken a little bit of that with me now, even to this probably more serious phase, genuine phase of my career. But it's so you do end up sort of taking bits and pieces from across those sort of early days. I imagine, I suppose we're all products of our own upbringings and experiences and journeys, and certainly I take things from various parts of my journey, even though there are probably moments you look back on and you think, oh, that was a bit cringeworthy, or oh, wasn't that a strange period of my life or something like that. But it all plays a part, and it all sort of shapes who you are. And I wouldn't change anything really. No, so from what it's it's all made me the person I am today.
Yeah, and then you mentioned almost like that phase where you building those skill sets. So let's call it like that generalist, which will resonate with strength and conditioning coaches listening. 2 things: that the importance of building different skill sets and playing around with things through experimentation, building those generalist skill sets before you specialize, and then also the hard work that you need to put in to create luck, the 2 to 3 years of unpaid work. Talk us through your mindset in that phase. How often did you have doubt on, is there ever going to be a career here? Am I going to be, am I going to be a professional in this space? Like 2 3 years is a long stretch. How were you making ends meet? Talk us through sort of how you got through that phase and what your motivation was, I guess, to keep yourself going for that long.
Look, it's a really good question. I was lucky in the sense that, lucky on a couple of fronts. I mean, lucky I was still living at home and a very supportive, I was sort of in my late teens, early 20s at that stage. I was still living at home, so a very good, supportive family. I suppose, I owe my family everything. Even at times you might get frustrated by some of the things they do, or at the times, even, maybe their decisions in moments weren't necessarily the right ones, but, I was always felt loved and supported, and ultimately they were always my parents were always going to support me in whatever I sort of wanted to try to do or achieve. So that clearly played a big part in giving you freedom. I had some couple of part-time jobs, which were good sort of part-time jobs to, make a bit of money to keep you going, and just have a bit of money to just live a sort of uni student life. And I was still studying as well, so it was a bit of a balance at that point. I probably, maybe to an extent, I was lucky in the sense that I think ultimately what it came down to at that point is it was a passion, and like I just wouldn't have done it, all that stuff, commentating local footy. I've sort of grown up around Melbourne's sort of inner southeastern suburbs, and I was driving out sort of an hour every week to commentate games in the MPNFL in the Casey Cardinia League. So fair way from where I sort of was living at the time, and would be learning, voluntary, and was learning players' names during the week, and printing off sheets and trying to find out who was number 7 for Tooradin or Beaconsfield, and trying to play games in my mind, trying to make mental shortcuts to remember names and things like that. So stuff like that. But ultimately, I enjoyed it, and it was, even if there are moments that might have been tedious, or you might have been busy, or you might have had to sacrifice, whether it was sacrificing, social arrangements, or sacrificing my uni, probably went by the wayside a bit. But I think ultimately, when I look back at the things I was doing at that period in my life, I was doing them because I wanted to have a proper crack at it, and I don't think I would have done that. And I don't want to make it sound like I was a hero or anything. Like, it wasn't. I'm not. We're not slitting the atom or fighting wars or anything. I mean, it was going out and commentating footy games and stuff like that. But I think if you have the passion, you sort of you're willing to go and do that sort of unpaid toil, and practice your writing. And I remember I was writing for this website, Backpage Lead, which was sort of the most noteworthy, I suppose, thing I did before. And it wasn't particularly noteworthy, but it was the most noteworthy thing I did before the age. And I remember the first time they sort of said, "Oh, we'd like to pay you a bit for your it was like $50 an article or something like that." And the first time they said, "Oh, we'd like to pay you for your work. Like, we feel like, we really appreciate all you're doing, your writing, and we'd just, and they said they feel bad that I'm doing it for free, and they said, we'd like to actually pay you something." And that was a point. I remember that was there've been a handful of moments in my professional life where you felt really get a real buzz, and that was a moment where I thought, wow, like, I know it's not much, and it was, it's nothing something wasn't going to live off at that point, but it was like, well, my work has some sort of financial value, and like, it's just sort of reinforced. It was a moment I thought, well, maybe I can do this. Maybe that was the moment. I think that was probably the moment I thought, yeah, maybe there is actually something here. Because until that point, when it's just voluntary, you think, oh, am I just misguided here? Am I just like any other? Am I just like a lot of kids who would like to sort of do this? And where's this future actually going? Or is this just going to be a little phase in my life, and I'll end up just going off and working in administration somewhere, or as a lawyer, or I don't know, some sort of sort of conventional desk job. Not to downplay that, but
moving from a passion project to it.
Yeah, it was a passion project, and that was that. I do remember that moment. It must have been, sort of late 2013 or so, where I thought, oh, okay, maybe there's something here.
Yeah, it's a good message for those that do want to give, and how much of an impact that can have. That could have been the crossroads or the start of, just to give you a little bit, like you said, that confidence and those little wins where they can lead to. So, I think there's a lot in that. There's a lot of gems for whether it be developing athletes, coaches, business owners, everyone's going to have a drive and passion for something. I certainly believe that. So discovering it, you were lucky enough to find it at the age of 5, which is very, very well done. For others, it might take a little bit longer, but listening to your gut and sticking to it, is inspirational, mate. And you mentioned the importance of putting in the work and the consistency over that time and initiative. What were some ways that you would action that initiative? Is that like emails, building your network base, or what did an initiative mean to you?
Yeah, I think that's sort of it. I mean, probably the biggest initiative there was starting this commentary channel, this Footy Couch, which was a pretty shambolic exercise in hindsight. A lot of technical difficulties. It was with a bunch of mates, and so it was a good. We had our blues because we would just, and at the end of the day, because it was all sort of, it wasn't a job for us; it was a hobby. We were all trying to balance the rest of our lives around that, and rostering was an issue, and we were, to go out and get some equipment and things like that, and it was, not many people were listening, but I suppose trying to, that was probably, from an initiative perspective, that was a standout, because that at least got the ball rolling and showed, and opened a couple of other doors, and was just pushing that I suppose push that idea that, at least from a personal note, that I was keen to take, and at that point it was probably just taking that somewhere. I don't know where that would end up, I can't even remember what the long-term goal for that was. I mean, maybe we thought, because we saw this thing in the UK, which we thought was moderately successful, and in fact, from which the Test match show from the UK, some people have gone on to become professional broadcasters from that. So in a weird way, it sort of has proven a bit of a pathway, that model. But that was probably the biggest initiative. And then from there, it's very much, it's just sort of a lot of that repeat stuff. It's, whether it's within that Footy Couch realm, so trying to push through website redesign or advertisers or social media, which was still, I mean, it wasn't in its embryonic phase, but we're talking more than 10 years ago now. So it was a different beast then. Advertising, I remember when we started doing these comedy festival shows, which are sort of these live shows, I remember we went off and printed, we got all these flyers printed, and we stood outside Richmond Station handing flyers ahead of some early season AFL games, people getting off and I'm not sure how many of those end up going in, but it was something. But it's emails, it's having ideas for stories. When I was starting to write for Backpage Lead, applying for jobs on Seek, trying to organise network coffees, asking experienced people for advice. I mean, none of it was groundbreaking. They're all sort of pretty conventional standard networking mechanisms, but it all adds up. And I think I say that, and and then in many respects that actually it's actually a great pathway for journalism, because so much of journalism is about relationship. I think most of professional life is about relationships. Also, not most, but a lot of professional life is about relationships. Certainly journalism is, and having initiative and curiosity and being willing to sort of, cold call people, cold email, cold message, whatever it is, people is a big part of it. And, sometimes it might be, you might get a response, or people aren't, you might annoy people a bit, but I think both at that stage and in the long run, personally, that sort of being willing to sort of put yourself out there a bit is probably, I think it's the only way. I think that, nothing, if you don't do anything, nothing's going to get done. I mean, it's obvious, but I've said that to, as I said, when you talk to kids or young people trying to get into media or anything, you just say, look, you just got to do it. The only way to do it is to do it, if that makes sense.
Yeah, 100%. And what about for yourself? Like, were there strong influences that you looked up to, or mentors, so to speak, that you would catch up for coffees or remotely over the phone, however it might look? Or was that something that wasn't really um, possible until you sort of were working in a place like the Age and you're in environments?
Look, I was lucky. I mean, I didn't sort of grow up having a sort of an enormous network. Like I didn't sort of know like a heap of. I didn't have any sort of family background in it or anything like that. In media, probably, I think maybe my again, it was a bit of a networking thing. Like through my dad knew someone who's sort of loosely involved in it, and they caught up the coffee with them, but and little things like that. You're sort of just taking any sort of half connection you might have here or there and trying to sort of get some sort of advice. But in terms of major mentors, early days, a couple of people I'm very grateful for. Over really for, again, I owe a lot to them. Are Ash Brown, who's still very much in the sports media and the senior writer at the AFL Record and works for SEN, the former Croc Media, not so much the state. It does do some stuff on the air, but sort of more as a writer. And he was at AFL Media. He's had a veteran, a long career. He was at the Age years ago and Sportal. I sort of knew him through loosely through the Jewish community, having grown up in the Jewish community, and he was someone who'd sort of done it and provided opportunity at Backpage Lead. He was sort of involved in Backpage Lead a bit, and he sort of helped with that. And then and the other guy was a guy named Charlie Happel, who was also involved. He was running Backpage Lead at the moment at that stage, so he sort of was giving me my regular sort of gigs there, and was a very good. And he was a former Age sports editor, who's given me a lot of good guidance and counsel. So there were. It was. I mean, they were. It was probably somewhat irregular. It wasn't as though I wouldn't say I had sort of someone who I was constantly asking. Like, I don't think it wasn't sort of I had like a journalism whisperer that you would talk to every week, like saying, "Oh, this is what I should do this week." But there were just some good people who along the journey would try to support, and was they're probably two of the key ones that really pushed me along my journey. But there are several others that sort of had become through just mutual contacts. I would get in touch with, or they would put on to me as sort of, you should talk to this person. And there's been a host of people across my life, but across all phases of this journey and continuing through my career that, I'm very generous for people for giving me my time, and even for giving their time. And even, it's something actually now, again, when younger people who are trying to break into the industry, I try to reciprocate that, because I do think back to when I was trying to break in. You think that really does resonate. So I try as much as I can. When you get a message or a call or an email or whatever, just to respond and try to organise to catch up with people or to talk to them on the phone. And even also, I'd say as a young journalist, I would have I have a lot of time. Well, I don't forget the people that early in my career, just even sort of more club contacts and things like that, senior industry people who were happy to sort of give me the time of day to listen to me as a young journo starting out. And then when I got to the Age, it was I'm blessed really to walk into an incredible team. Really, you walk into sort of a team. I mean, I'll never forget the first Monday morning I walked in. It was sort of early in the 2014 season. We'd had a Monday morning footy meeting, and I looked around. There's sort of, Caroline Wilson and Rowan Connolly and Greg Baum and Emma Quayle, Jake Nile, these people that I just, grown up, it sounds a bit geeky, sort of idolising journalists. I wouldn't say necessarily idolise them, but, I looked up to them, and they were the biggest names in the industry. Wayne Carey was a columnist, was there, and it was just like, what am I doing here? What am I, this 23-year-old kid with very little experience doing here? And, in their own ways, all of the people I worked with at the age have taught me a lot. I've been lucky to have a lot of very good mentors and sounding boards. Very early days, a guy like John Purick was excellent to me. Peter Rooyen in the last few years when he moved from AFL Media. But I'm a bit reluctant to even sort of talk through to start individualize. Like it sounds like a coach, but reluctant to individualize because a lot of very good advice and mentors, and you really couldn't have been any better place to walk into because you're just dealing with some of the best and really all time and greats of the sports media industry in this country. So an incredible place to work.
100%, mate. That's it must have been. You must have been pinching yourself at that moment, being in that meeting. What about from a mental point of view? How did you feel? Like you said, you were younger than the rest of the guys sitting in that space. So how did you feel from a connection point of view? How did you go about building relationships for those listening in that have maybe just in that space now where they're not feeling overwhelmed, but they're like, wow, I'm in it now, and now I've got to prove myself. How do you feel looking back now? What did you feel someone could have given you advice to help support that phase?
Yeah, that's a really interesting thought. I think overall, look, I suppose I survived. I survived. I was on a 12-month contract, maternity leave contract to start with, and I got through that, and I kept on there. So I suppose I must have handled it okay or well enough. But I think you're lucky. There are certain people that I think you build natural rapport to, and some people who sort of are always looking out for you. And I think it's tricky because senior people, they've got their own jobs to go about and just go about their own work, and everyone's busy, and you're in a very fast-paced competitive environment, and it's constantly there's no room for breathing in the newspaper space because it's a daily paper to put out, and you've got a website to keep up, and you're always looking you're looking short-term, long-term, medium-term. It's all just happening quickly, and there's not much, there's no sort of, it's a bit, I'm sure it's very intense, and I know it's very intense saying that at a footy club, but conversely, at a footy club, for instance, you're building up towards a pre-season, whereas there is no real pre-season at a 24/7, 365 news outlet. It's all the time.
Same day, every day.
Every day and every minute, and that's what's really changed in an online setting. I think I was probably over it. I was probably over-eager and probably stepped on a few toes. Like, I don't think I was terrible in that sense, but there probably a few times where I was maybe a bit too keen. But I also, I don't necessarily regret that. Like, I think you're trying to sort of make an impression, and it's interesting because people can be, people not that people want to protect their patch necessarily, but people sort of comfortable in their own seniority, and they might, I can understand people thinking, who's this upstart kid, thinks he knows everything. And there are probably times when if I'd maybe taken a bit of, held back 10 or 20% of it in terms of exuberance, or maybe played the political situation a touch better, I would have been well advised. But I think it's never going to be absolutely perfect in that respect. But I think overall I tried to be respectful, and I think overall I was reasonably respectful of sort of the senior people and not even just senior, of everyone. And I think ultimately you want to try to treat everyone around the office well. You just want to try to treat people well and treat them as though how you'd like to be treated. And that can be hard because when you come in, you sort of wanting to make a really good impression. I think it ultimately comes down to being, and particularly in a job like that where you sort of need to have initiative and you need to be a bit you need to have a bit of edge to sort of go above and beyond. And probably some of the best people are probably a lot of the best people stepped on toes at some point.
Yep.
So it is a balance, and I think you'd sort of rather die wondering than not. But probably it is also worthwhile. And I'm sure I imagine it's similar in any field. You just to still remain respectful and probably wouldn't say deferential, but certainly be aware of that the people just continually keep in mind that the people that you're working with have a lot of experience, and they've probably seen it all before, and they're always worth listening to. And I think over the journey I have taken a lot of. That's one thing I did do, take advice on board. I'm not saying that I unfailingly stuck to it. I've made errors, continue to make errors today, and you're never perfect and always trying to learn and improve. But I think, just try to take on board the advice of those senior people around you.
Yeah, great advice, mate. Love that. So be yourself. Go for it and push the boundaries, like you said. Go above and beyond, but then also having that awareness, like you said, to pull it back at times and be able to manage it. I think that's really sound advice for anyone listening. What about some challenges? Was there one that stands out, a particular challenge in your career to date, and what did you learn and how did you grow from it?
I think the challenges are ongoing, and every day you pose the new set of challenges, which can be tight, which makes it an interesting job and a stimulating job, but also hence sometimes a stressful job. So that's sort of the eternal tension between that is the part of it that's you're always on to the next. Even if you have a good day, you just move on to the next one. I think the hardest days have been ones where I've sort of felt where I realised I've got things wrong, or at least gone too early, or just or a bit too hard or too far on things. There are probably a couple of stories that there's not many, but there's probably two or three over the years where and it's never done in the sense of you're trying to make stuff up. And I think that's where probably people misunderstand media. I've never known a journalist to try to make stuff up or fabricate things. It's where you are maybe either too trusting or not diligent enough. And there are probably a couple of times where one was quite early in my career. There's a story that I had sort of a couple of sources, but I probably was not. It was about St Kilda Football Club and a potential move to Älskinvik Park at a time when they were sort of weighing up whether they were going to. They'd been knocked back off Junction Oval, I think, because of an state election result, and they were maybe going to move back to Moorabbin. They were unhappy at Seaford. This is more than 7 or 8 years ago now, and in the end, it wasn't a huge deal. But I probably wasn't quite diligent enough in terms of going through processes with making sure it was around New Year's. It was around the New Year as well. I think some of their staff weren't there at the time, and I probably just jumped the gun. I thought, he's a really cool story, and I think there was probably an element of truth to it, but it was not enough. I probably overplayed it as well, and it was just an example of where you just need to be careful to. It just would have been a better way to go about it, and maybe hold back for a second. I think where journalists run into trouble, and where even now is you run into trouble, is that challenge of speed versus accuracy. Because at the end of the day,
Gotta be fair.
That is the eternal challenge. I think that's where most journalists get into trouble. Is you're not ultimately your job is to get things right and to be accurate, but also and to be fair. but also part of it is to, especially if you're in the news breaking scene, or even if you're not in the necessary news breaking scene, but you're in the storytelling, you still got to try to, if you're more of a sort of an interviewer or analysis, but even if you're a feature writer or a columnist or whatever, you still got it. There's still a timeliness element to it. So even if you're more writing a feature or there's still time pressures, but particularly in the news breaking sense. And yeah, a couple of occasions where you probably sometimes you just get let down by things change, and maybe sometimes you probably just need to take a fraction of heat off a story. Well, here's even an example of that's relatively recent. Read a story in 2020 after COVID's it was during the COVID cuts, and there was uncertainty about what was going to happen with the VFL competition. Yep. I was hearing some strong mail that North Melbourne were pretty much going to get rid of their VFL program after 1 year of being a standalone again. And I knew they made a couple of their key VFL staff redundant. I think the coach and their head of VFL, and I'd had it confirmed by someone in the know that I could sort of put to them, is this, you're going to have a VFL team next year? And that person said it was, they suggested, I didn't think so. And I was sort of reached a point where, bringing all that together, I was like, I'm pretty confident this is not going to happen. They're going to be out. And I think I wrote a story that, I think the line was North Melbourne's VFL program is dead, or is effectively dead. And within a couple of months, they had sort of banding together resources, and they have a VFL team now. To cut to the chase, they have a team in 2021 and 2022. And I think when they announced that, I got a bit of flack from people on social media. That's fair enough, because you held to account to what you're right. And it's probably an example of a situation where I was not, I think I went through every step of the process to a reasonable degree. I think I used care and caution in trying to solidify my facts. But maybe if I'd just been, it's a good example of a time where maybe if I'd said, North Melbourne's VFL program is imperiled, or is unlikely, or there are grave doubts, rather than just going there. Sometimes you can try to get the sensational, dead, and the truth is you want to maybe give yourself a little bit of wiggle room, because things change, even though you're probably right at the time. And I feel like I was, right at the time. If I'd probably give myself a little bit more of an out, that would have been a good, and that's a good learning example. So it's times like that, that was not a huge story, a huge amount of grief over that, but it still sits a little bit uneasily, things like that. And it's sometimes, so stuff like that, others where you jump to, you rush to get stuff out because you're giving you believe are good sources, but you're better off double or triple checking, or right past other people. So that's the biggest challenge, and that's an internal challenge. Even today, you deal with stuff like every day. You sort of, at some level, you deal with that sort of stuff. But I think overall, because every single moment, when you get a morsel of a story that you think you want to break it, you want that sugar hit. But ultimately, well, I do at least. But ultimately, I think it's good to remind yourself that I'd still rather be second and right than first and wrong. I mean, you'd like to be both first and right, and maybe you can get away with, a lot of the time you can get away with being first and 90% or 95% right. You want to ideally get to a situation where you can be 100% right, and sometimes, but to be 100% right, you're actually better off shaving off 10% of the story, so that even if you might miss a bit of the more sensational bit, it's more watertight, if that makes sense.
Yeah, it's fascinating, mate. I can imagine how challenging that would be, because like you said, every second counts, and it's super competitive, plus there's high demand. So yeah, I can't imagine how you'd manage that. The two sides. One, it would be interesting to hear about how you what coping strategies you do to be able to thrive in that environment from a mental point of view and stress. But we'll go first for the how competitive is it? Are you aware of other journos that have heard of these morsels as you're hearing them, and then there's a bit of banter between journos and things like that? Or is it pretty much you don't know what you don't have time to worry about what everyone else is doing. You're just focusing on your story, and then you're waiting once you've gone through your process. The competition doesn't matter. You go. Talk us through about that.
Oh, look, I think rarely will you know what someone else, certainly from another, maybe within your own outlet, you might know what they're working on. Certainly at the age, we were quite a big footy, for instance, or cricket team, and you usually have some idea of, or often have some idea of what they were working on in any given day. But you don't generally have an idea of what other outlets are on. Occasionally, very occasionally, you will you might be tipped off that someone else is, you might have been, say, waiting for a response from another party on a story, from an interested party on a story, or waiting for them to update you on a key detail before you sort of run with the story, just to make it a better story, or to give it a bit of due diligence or a bit more time. And then occasionally you might be tipped off, say, oh, you probably should run with this now because someone else is onto it. That does happen from time to time. Right. I'm sure it's happened both ways. I'm sure there have been times when, I've been the one both to benefit and to lose from that sort of thing. I'm conscious of, I try to remain very conscious of what others are doing, in the sense of, I suppose before I publish anything of any sort of breaking news significance, I will, or even before sometimes even before I make, because what might happen, sometimes you might get a piece of information, you think, oh, has that been out yet? Because it's impossible to keep track of absolutely everything. So, and the easiest way is to search Twitter and Google to see, has anyone reported this yet? And if they have, I will often just drop them, because it's like it's out there, and I've just missed it. That happens sometimes. Usually, if it's a big enough story, you've probably seen it. Given those are it's my job, so it's my job to stay on top of things. So no, rarely. I mean, I suppose that the nature of the competitions, it's probably like with anything with IP. You don't want others to be aware of what you're doing, because you don't want them to, scoop you, and vice versa. But occasionally you'll know. And in terms of, how you deal with that, with those stresses. I think it's tricky, because of social media and because of the internet. It can be all the time, and probably early in my career, and even now you still struggle. But probably earlier in my career, it was like you'd really struggle to switch off. And now I'm better at, and at times occasionally it's because it can be a matter of seconds. And I know it sounds ridiculous, but it can actually be a matter of seconds. Rarely is it a matter of seconds. Often it's a matter of minutes, and plenty of times it's a matter of hours. But I will try to every now and again, even for a few hours a week, whether it's switching my phone off. I've been much better over I've had a concerted effort actually from just before COVID, but I've done so for about a couple of years, to sort of not sleep with my phone in my room, just because I found it very hard to switch off searching through social media or websites, or because you just get in that rabbit hole, because there's always something more to know or to search or to look, or they call it doom scrolling. And I think it's really important to stay and I can tell if there are periods where you're like, I don't feel fresh, and you need to be able to freshen up. So that's a good mechanism on a sort of daily basis, and then for a weekly basis, and maybe it's a few hours of just putting your phone down, putting it on flight mode for a few hours, just to, and you'd run the risk if you miss the call that's bloody the biggest story of the year. Like and that's always a bit, because unfortunately it's not a job where if it was a 9-to-5 job and you could sit there and you knew, if I put in the hard work for these 38 hours a week, then I'll get X results. That'd be great, but it doesn't work like that. So there is a trade-off, and but I think in the long run, you need, in long run, I'll get more out of my performance if my time off is genuine time off. Don't get sucked into having, try to make it like when I'm working, and when I'm not, and try to delineate to an extent. It can be tricky, but at least try to find some sort of clear air. It's like, this is a time that I'm just trying not to think about it, and try to, remove myself from my phone and just spend some quality time with loved ones, or or just by myself, go for a walk or a run or something like that, all that sort of stuff.
Yep. And what about like those stories where, like you said, you reflect on them and you're like, well, I still went through my process that has served you, but there was just a timing judgment where you went a little bit earlier than, in hindsight, and then you cop it in social media and you the way it unfolds, like the North Melbourne one. How do you manage that? I mean, that would be very similar for high performance athletes, celebrities. How do you deal with that judgment on a public scenario like that?
Yeah, look, it's hard. It can be, I want to say it's hard. Like it can wait, especially when they're people. It's funny, like if it's just people who just abuse you, I'm actually not as upset. Often it's more a water off the duck's back. They're just sort of outright abuse, and you don't respect someone's, and I can just tell that they're just trolling. That's actually almost easier, because I just sort of disregard their opinion, because I just feel as though they're doing it to get a rise out of you. Whereas sometimes if it's someone who you might actually respect, or someone within the industry or credibility, and sometimes people just go at you, even if it's not on social media, it might be you might get a message from someone in the industry who just was unhappy with the way something was reported, and sometimes they're just going to be unhappy. And the truth is, when you're in this caper, you're going to make some people unhappy by the things you report, and that you just got to cop that. And it's sort of trying to become comfortable with being uncomfortable, and trying to remind yourself, taking some deep breaths and say, look, this is why this has happened. I think it's probably going through the process, but I think, look, it can be emotionally draining, because you need to try to reassure yourself that you've gone through the correct process, and then you can, and sometimes you need to think through it. But I think that is again where it's really important that even if you get that negative feedback, and even if it's important, I think, to think about, to take that on board, because sometimes, even though social media can be a cesspit, but there are things you can learn from that and from people, and sometimes people make valid points. And look, sometimes you make a minor error in the story, that people pick it up. That's one of the good things about social media. They pick it up in a minute, and you change it online, and it's no harm done. But
yeah.
I think it's about taking it on board, and just trying to have people that I think ultimately what it comes down to is having people whose opinions you value and trust, and who, if you listen to, if you have people whose opinions you respect, and if they're giving you feedback, you're more likely to take it on board, and you'll go to them. Maybe if there's something that happens, it's having someone to say, oh, look, what do you think of this? What do you think of this issue? And if they, and talking it through with them, and then you often feel a lot more comfortable having actually talked through it with them, and they often will empathize with you. And then also the other thing is just being able to put a bit of a full stop on it, at least for the day, and just not taking it to bed with you, just trying to have a moment where you can zone off and zone out, and be able to sort of remove yourself from that spiral, having other things in your life. Go and read a book, go and, talk. I'm recently married, go and talk to my wife about her life and her day, and, watch a show with her, or just anything, just to take your mind off it. And I think that So you try to learn, but you also try to make sure it doesn't completely control your life, because you can always get sucked into these sorts of vortexes, so to speak.
Yeah, and you've mentioned process a few times. Over your experience, what are some of the best ways that you've refined your process? Is that through making mistakes and then reflecting on it and then that way, or is it speaking to other mentors with experience that you work with? Talk us through how you've worked.
I think it's both. I think, Jack, I think it's both of those are very good. Certainly, I think you do learn from mistakes, and I'm not saying I've never repeated mistakes, but I think over the course over say 10-year period or so now, I feel like the mistakes I was making earlier are not ones I'm making nearly as much, or sort of have watered them down. And I think, some of those, probably sometimes the emotional impact of things like those stories and stuffing up, actually, then the discomfort. I don't want to say pain, because I don't think it's necessarily pain, but sort of the maybe embarrassment, or the feeling of the dissatisfaction, or the feeling of I should have done better there, does drive you, and hope, and I think does guide you to say, and you might only have one or two of these moments a year where you're like, they wear away really quite heavily, but I think, across the course of 10 years, there's probably been, say, a dozen moments like that where you think you've really learned something, and you think, and that's not saying that I haven't learned a lot at all the time. You're always learning it at some level, but I think those moments where you stuff up a bit do end up becoming huge learning moments, because they sit in your mind, and the next time you're in your mind recognizes patterns, and like, hang on, this is what I've been in this position before. This was where I felt I came into trouble. If another situation like that North Melbourne came up again, or St Kilda, or there was a situation where there's stories about a player injury that I a couple of years ago that I thought I had good mail on, but probably didn't quite go. And that was more a speed and accuracy, a speed thing. But again, it just says, okay, well, you're here, but have you thought about this? Because you've been there. And then also certainly from mentors and from senior people, and I was very lucky to work with some excellent people. I've learned, Jake and I learned a lot from, certain messages, certain things that he instilled in me from very early in my career, resonate to this day. Peter Ryan at the Age was an excellent sounding board. I'm just lucky to have a lot of, very good senior journalists I worked with, and even sometimes it's people at other outlets who are sort of rivals, and even though or sort of competitors, and sometimes even though you're not going to probably necessarily talk as many of the specifics, but I don't think you'd mind me saying, like, someone like Mitch Cleary at Channel 7 now, who I hugely respect and I get along with well, and sometimes you can just empathise, and you sort of tell little war stories, and you're like, and it helps you sort of in your own mind say, okay, yeah, I'm not the only one here. I this person's going through this as well, and you just Mark McGowan, who's sort of now a stable mate at News Corp, like another person who I sort of bounce things off like that a bit. So you end up learning from a whole range of people and from experiences, and I think ultimately that's just professional settings in life, and you just got to continually try to make sure that you take any negative experience and turn it into, even if not a positive, turn it into something that you can learn from.
Yeah, I love that, mate. Thanks for sharing. We'll move. You mentioned the importance of freshening up through watching movies, reading books. So that's a good segue for the next part, which is more a lighter section of the podcast, the get to know you, mate, section. So First one on that note, which movie or TV series, can be a book as well, has impacted you the most and why? This is nothing to do with journalism. This is just...
Yeah, I think ultimately it's probably The Simpsons or Seinfeld, just because I sort of immersed myself in it as a kid and even into my adolescence and probably my 20s. But both those shows, but particularly Simpsons. I think I just grew up with The Simpsons. So I quote it all the time. I don't think I necessarily learned any great philosophical things from it, but it probably shaped my sense of humor, and that Seinfeld did too. There were some books I actually reckon some of the books we did at high school, like Catcher in the Rye, really resonated with me. It's quite a famous book. I remember in year 12, that was a period where I felt was quite a transformative time in my life. And I thought, that resonated. Look, it's probably The Simpsons.
Yep. Awesome. Simpsons and Seinfeld, you can't go wrong. Relaxing session. Favorite inspirational quote or life motto?
I think the one that I was thinking of this earlier today, the one that resonates, and I don't know who said it initially, but I think the idea of the pain of hard work being better than the pain of regret. And I think, or something along those lines, I'm going to butcher that slightly, but that sort of mantra of you'd rather, I suppose it's sort of that idea of you'd rather not die wondering. So it's that sort of idea of, you get into a situation, I'd rather scratch that itch, so to speak. And I think in my life, I've tried to err on the side of, and sometimes you get in the situations in journalism actually where you're like, and it's not even necessarily about hard work. It's just about, you have to make a really awkward call or chase up a lead that's like, do I really, like this is going to be tedious, painful, but you just force yourself to do it. And often enough, it ends up being worthwhile. And that extra call, that extra call back, or that extra, someone calls you back at an inconvenient time and you just, can I really be bothered talking to that person now? But it's generally worth it. I mean, obviously, as I said, you do need it can be overkill, and you're always balancing, if I take that call, well, I mightn't get a good night's sleep and I'm better off actually wait until tomorrow. So there is a balance to be struck, but I think I'd err on the side of taking the call most of the time.
Yep. And what about in your work life? What makes you angry? What are your pet peeves?
I think what makes me angry is I think ultimately what makes you angry is as a journalist, there's two things I sort of ask of people as sort of who are sort of on the other side of it, I suppose, subjects of journalism or media managers or things like that, is not to lie and to be, I'm not saying to be texting you back in 5 seconds, but sort of to respond to you within a somewhat reasonable time frame. So those are probably the two things that I've long insisted those are the only two things I think I take as sort of almost I think should be taken almost as a given, or then the rest I find is almost a bonus, and I understand when there are times people can't say, people say, look, I can't tell you this or that. And occasionally, and while that can be frustrating in the moment, I understand that, but I think it's the lack of, I suppose it's the lack of respect in the sense of just sort of respecting that, I have a job to do, so at least, treat me, show me the dignity to sort of, not just me, anyone, the dignity to sort of acknowledge that I've been in contact with you at some point. So those are probably the two things that really I sort of said as that really annoy me when they're not followed. And I feel if they're not adhered to, you almost lose the right to when people don't adhere to those two, particularly if you know, I mean, it's often people, I find there's probably times when people tell half truths and manage to have plausible deniability. But when I know someone's lied to me, or someone just hasn't got back to me for days or whatever, they sort of, in some respects, forfeit, in my eyes, the right to. You sort of, next time you can't trust them, and next time they don't necessarily warrant that. And I still will try to do so where possible, but don't necessarily warrant that heads up call or something like that. Because if they haven't treated you with that sort of respect, then it's questionable as to whether they deserve those. So those are the two things that do annoy me.
Yeah, makes sense. And what about in a COVID-free world? What's your favourite way to spend your day off? Day off.
Yeah, I love being able to just switch off. Either just like on a nice day, just go for I love just going for a drive into a nice area, wherever it is, just explore a bit, drive and then drive and walk, go down to country town or something and walk around the shops, or walk around the nature walk, something like that. Or on the beach or anything like that. I just like to be able to switch off. Just sort of exploring places that I haven't been before on a day off. And it doesn't need to be anywhere exotic. Just be it could be another part of Melbourne that I haven't been to in a long time. Or just stuff like that. Just being able, and usually with my wife, occasionally by myself as well. But that sort of stuff. Nothing too exciting.
And you mentioned off air, you've started a new job with the Code. Take us through that transition from the Age, and what does a typical day look like, and what are you excited about as well for the rest of the year, mate, for 2022?
A really tough call to leave the Age, who had been, obviously a very renowned, institution in Melbourne, and almost probably nationally and maybe internationally. So a very tough call, and I had so much time for people there, and can't thank them enough for the chance I got there. It was just probably the chance for a bit more opportunity and freedom, and the chance to sink my teeth into something new, which was, it was sort of one of those things that was too good to pass up. Look, it hasn't probably changed my, it doesn't necessarily change my life enormously. I mean, the job is pretty similar. Probably have a bit more, I don't have to be quite as reactive to the daily news cycle, and have a bit more time to sort of explore leads and stories, and be a bit more freedom, maybe a bit more flexibility around the day, which has been, I suppose, a nice change. Again, not having to put out a newspaper as well means you probably get a bit more flexibility there, because you're not as bound by newspaper deadlines and that sort of thing. It's been great to get the chance to sort of sink my teeth into some longer form stuff, and have the chance to sort of explore various stories, and be to try to provide a new offering in the market. I think there's a lot. I think there's a lot going for the site, so for the rest of the year, I mean, we're sort of pretty fresh into the men's footy season, so it's still probably a little bit about finding what a standard week looks like, but it's hopefully trying to just with given the chance to remove ourselves from the daily news cycle a little bit. And it's not to say I'm not still trying to break news, because I am, but to be able to tell some stories that maybe haven't necessarily been as explored, or even just tell stories that at the time might be a little bit off to the side, but to sort of explore them a bit more deeply, talk to some players that maybe are a bit off the beaten track, some issues in the game, or in footy and cricket, the two sports I mainly cover, and some just different tales, and hopefully provide some nuance and analysis and insight, and something that provide the reader with something that I think, oh, this is interesting and worth subscribing to. So that's ultimately it. And that can come in various guises, but that's sort of it. Just trying to provide good, engaging content and try to continue to hopefully produce good journalism.
Yeah. And on that note, for the young journos out there, what is your philosophy with a good story? Like, how do you engage a reader? How do you hook a reader on with the title, and then of course provide good content that follows up with that title? What are some key pillars, I guess, to a good story?
Yeah, it's a great question, and it's one we still grapple with every day. And headlines are important, and we because of the social media age and the headline age, and in the 40 years ago, you would just pick up the newspaper and whatever was in it, and that was the news, and you just read the whole. You'd say, oh, that was interesting, that headline and that picture, and or you'd turn on the TV and whatever was there, and caught your attention, or it didn't. Whereas now it's such a shouting contest because there's so much out there. I think it's really important if you're writing. I think ultimately try to get the best stuff up the top, whatever that is, just whatever's most interesting, or just sort of a few of the really good principles I was taught were, get if there's an anecdote in a story, like say you've done a profile piece on someone or even on a theme, get that most interesting anecdote up the top as a hook. Put them in that, or whatever the most interesting topic is. And if it's, there was also Michael Gleeson, who was my former colleague at the Age. He gave me a really good tip pretty early on, after I'd sort of slightly, not bungled, but probably maybe just hadn't quite put the most newsy thing in a news story at the top. And he goes, what are people talking about at the pub? The pub test, imagine sitting, having 3 or 4, mates sitting around a pub. What's the thing they're talking about? Put that thing at the top, whatever it is, just whatever's interesting. So little things like that. And I think also, while I think clickbait can be problematic, because you can sort of, I've done clickbait stories, and clickbait clickbait probably gets a bad name because it's ultimately you're trying to get people into your story. So at any level, at some level, there's always a bit of clickbait, because we're always trying to, if you got a story, you want people to read it, but don't oversell. Don't give it something that it's not. Don't pretend like your story is something that's not. But also, by the same token, don't be afraid to, if there's something good in there, don't bury it. Don't, just because it might be a bit controversial or a bit edgy, like if you're including it in the story, give it a prominence, because there's no point. I think one thing is, there's no point having something good and burying it. If it's good, sell it. If it's not really there, don't try to sell it. Don't add don't pretend it's something it's not. But so those are probably some of the main principles that I think I try to adhere to, and I think are worth adhering to as you're coming into, as you're practicing your writing, and probably across all media. There's an element of that, but certainly in the written word. Yeah,
I think there's some takeaways there for social media, like you mentioned, the thumbnails and YouTube clips and headings, and you can transfer that to anyone that's listening. I know that's something that I'll practice from that sound advice, and hopefully this does reach out to a few journos that are aspiring to be like yourself, Daniel. I really appreciate your time, mate, for coming on and sharing with us your journey. Obviously, you're still well and truly in it, but being a decade in, you've had some great stories and experiences. So thanks so much for sharing what's worked for you, and success leaves clues, and you've had plenty of that. But then also being open and honest about the mistakes and what you learned from that, and how you've grown professionally and personally as well, mate. So thanks for jumping on.
No, it's a pleasure, Jack, and great work with the podcast and all you're doing on your channel, and all the best for the rest of the year.
No doubt. We'll see you hopefully at a crowd one day, with crowds back, the MCG.
No, that's great to see. So looking forward to it.
Awesome. Thanks for everyone that's listening as well. If you tuned in late, make sure to watch the full episode. You can watch that on our YouTube channel. And next week, we'll release the episode on our podcast channel, which will be on all the podcast directories. on Spotify, iTunes, and all the rest. Our next live chat will be next Thursday. It's a live collaborative event with Nathan Chapman, Mark Choco Williams, Kevin Ball, and Josh Crowden. So 4 AFL kicking experts. It'll be like a workshop. They'll present on a topic specifically to improving your kicking performance. So if you're a footballer out there or maybe a coach, definitely tune in for that one. It's the 31st of March at 8:30 p.m. I'll see you guys then.